Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar. The topic we will be discussing today is Behind the Numbers, Actuarial Calculations Explained. I think people will still be joining, but I'd like to start on time, just so we can end on time as well. Let me start by introducing myself. So my name is Julie Valentini. I'm an actuary at Monroe Consulting, Monroe Forensic Actuaries. I've been here for 15 years, and during that time I have produced thousands of actuarial reports. I've consulted with clients and assisted them in preparing for court or for settlement, and I have testified in court numerous times as well. So I have a good experience of the damages industry. I also have a particular focus on product development, so our calculations, making sure they're accurate, and then also the wording of our reports. It is a particular interest of mine to make sure our reports are simple and clear and easy for attorneys and judges to understand. So let's move on to the agenda for today. So there's really two topics that we will be covering, the loss of earnings and the loss of support calculations. So I'd just like to beforehand advise you that we will be sending the pack of slides to you within the next week. So don't feel that you need to take detailed notes. You will have the slides to refer to. We have enabled the Q&A part of the webinar though. So if you have a question at any time, please jot it down. We do have a colleague of mine will be moderating. So if it's a fairly straightforward question, she will be answering it during the webinar. Otherwise, there will be a Q&A session at the end where I will tackle some of the more detailed questions or common questions. So please, at any time, if there's anything you'd like more clarity on, please pop it in the Q&A. Okay, so let's move on with the purpose of this whole webinar. So what we are intending is that you will walk away with a better understanding of that all-important final number that is shown in our reports. So it's understanding the claim and how the calculation is built so that you can read and interrogate any actuarial report with confidence. To also understand the drivers and some of the unusual terms that we talk about, like the net discount rate and contingencies and the RAF cap. And then lastly, whether you're advising on settlement or presenting evidence under cross-examination, understanding the methodology puts you in a stronger position negotiation-wise. So that is the ultimate aim of this, to give you a better understanding and make you more confident in what you're doing. So let's start with loss of earnings. I'm going to start very simply and define the past and the future period, because that is sometimes misunderstood as well. When we talk about the past, we are talking about the period from the date of accident up until the date of calculation. I've just put some dummy dates in there as an example. It tends to be a couple of years, but you know, we do see up to 10 years sometimes. But that is what is defined as the past period. The future period is the period from the date of calculation up until the date of retirement. And that tends to typically be a longer period. Obviously, it depends on the age of the claimant, but it can be a few decades even. So just to always have that in your mind, that is what the past represents, that is what the future represents. Now, when we talk about a loss of earnings calculation, just a reminder, a loss of earnings claim compensates an individual for earnings that have been lost as a result of an incident. So it's the earnings they've lost. That's the key part. And I'm going to describe it in a picture. I always find it easiest to understand it pictorially. And I know some people are scared of graphs. Hopefully, if I explain it, the graph will make more sense to you. We always show a graph in our reports as well, because I think it does just show that other perspective, which can be helpful. So when we do a loss of earnings calculation, there are two earning streams that are important to consider. The first one is the uninjured earning stream, which is also called, sometimes referred to as but for the accident earning stream. And that is what I've shown here on the graph. So on the x-axis, the bottom axis, we've got the calendar year. So in this case, in 2023, the accident occurred. This red line is the date of calculation, and then retirement is right on the end here. So anything to the left of the red line is the past period, and anything to the right is the future period. The y-axis here would be the earnings per month. So in this case, what I'm showing is that in 2023, when the accident happened, this claimant would have earned just under 25,000 Rand per month. It then increases incrementally every year until reaching some ceiling, and the ceiling is at about 35,000 Rand per month, and then remains level up until retirement. Now, this earning stream is generally obtained from an industrial psychologist report. So important to remember, the actuaries don't come up with the earning stream. We would take it from an industrial psychology report, or sometimes from instructions from the attorney, or even sometimes from a judge. But we basically translate those words into the numbers and into a graph like this. The second earning stream we look at is the injured earning stream, which is sometimes called the now that earning stream. So now that the accident has occurred. So it is shown here by the lighter grey line, and you can see in this case, there is nothing to the left of the red line. And the reason for that in this particular case would be that the claimant didn't return to work after. Then, at the date of calculation, which is now, the industrial psychologist has proposed that they could earn 10,000 Rand per month, and that this now increases to a ceiling, which you can see occurs a bit later than the ceiling in the uninjured. So that one occurs before 2033, this one is after 2033, and then remains level up until retirement. So those are the two important earning streams that we get from an industrial psychologist report. And the very simple concept that I'd like you to understand is that it's really just the difference between those two that is the loss of earnings. So it sounds very simple. You might wonder, okay, why all the fuss then? It is simple for the past. So basically, we can just add up this difference, and that will give you your past loss. However, the future gets a little bit more complicated, and I'm going to go into detail about why. There's two main reasons. The first is what we refer to as the time value of money, and the second is the probability of survival. So let's first look at the time value of money, and I'm going to give you a little analysis or metaphor that hopefully explains what the time value of money means. So let's assume that a T-shirt currently costs 100 Rand. If inflation was 6%, this T-shirt would cost 106 Rand in 1 year's time. Now, suppose we wanted to invest money now so that we had enough to buy the T-shirt next year. Let's say we put 100 Rand into a balanced mix of assets, and let's assume those assets grew at 8.65%. What would those assets have grown to in 1 year? They will end up at 108 Rand and 65 cents. Now, that's actually more than the cost of the T-shirt. So we didn't actually need to invest the full 100 Rand now to pay for the T-shirt. So if we want to work out how much do we need to invest to get to the 106 Rand next year, we actually do the opposite of what we did here, the calculation. And we refer to it as discounting. You might have heard us use that term if we've discussed these issues with you. But we basically discount the 106 Rand for 1 year at 8.65%, and we can work out that you actually need to invest 97 Rand and 56 cents. If it grows by 8.65%, it'll be enough to cover the T-shirt next year. So that's a very simple concept that I just wanted to show you in simplistic terms, assuming there's a T-shirt. We use the same principle, though, when we calculate the lump sum that is sufficient to meet future losses. So what we do in each month, we increase the earnings with earnings inflation, and we do use that figure of 6%. So in other words, if we assume the claimant earned 100 Rand per month, I'm just using easy figures, 100 Rand per month this year, we assume that they'd earn 106 Rand next year. But just like in the T-shirt example, we don't need to pay out 100 Rand this month to cover that 106 Rand, because we assume that the lump sum would grow at 8.65%. So we can discount that 106 Rand by the 8.65% to get to our 97 Rand 56 cents that you actually would need to hold now. So it's the same idea as the T-shirt, but we do that in every month with our loss of earnings calculation. If the claimant would have needed, say, 100 Rand next year, we don't need to pay out 100 Rand now. We can pay out slightly less because there is time to still earn an investment return on that money. And that is really the concept of the time value of money. That's why you can't just add up those future losses. We actually discount them and hold slightly less because they can grow to be sufficient to meet those earnings. A concept that I'm not going to go into too much detail, but that you might hear about is the net discount rate. And that really is just the difference between the earnings inflation figure and the investment return figure. So the 6% versus the 8.65%, it's not a straight sort of mathematical difference. There's a little slight nuance to it, but it works out to 2.5%. And basically, instead of growing the T-shirt by 6% and then discounting it at 8.65%, you can actually just take the 100 Rand and discount at 2.5%. It's just a little mathematical formula that works out. The reason why I'm telling you is that 99% of actuaries that do damages work all use a net discount rate of 2.5%. And that is the important number that affects the calculation. So as long as the actuaries are using that, we should get the same results, even if we use a different investment return assumption or a different earnings inflation assumption. So that is all about the time value of money. The second thing that affected the future losses is the probability of survival or the mortality rates. So not everyone will definitely live until retirement age. Obviously, the older you get, the higher your chance of dying in a particular year. And there are standard life tables based on population data that indicates the probability of survival each year. And this probability of survival decreases with age. We therefore multiply the monthly losses with a claimant's probability of being alive in each month. Excuse me. So that does reduce those future losses as well. So if we go back to that graph, instead of just adding up these losses, we multiply them by the probability that the claimant would be alive to get to the value of them in today's terms. So I hope that explains a bit about the future, because we have sometimes had people ask, well, can't I just work out this loss and times it by the number of years? But the future has these little tweaks to it. You might be wondering about the time value of money in the past, why it doesn't apply there. And it actually does apply. However, there are rules for specifically RAF calculations that say that we shouldn't apply interest to the past. So even though in principle it is the same, because a vast majority of our calculations are for RAF, we don't allow for the time value of money in the past. That's why we can actually just add up those losses. Okay, so because we make those adjustments, behind the scenes, the graph actually changes from that to a graph that looks a little bit more like that. Now, we never show you this graph because I think that would be quite confusing, but that is behind the scenes what is actually happening when we allow for the time value of money and the probability of survival. I want to then show you how this translates into the numbers that come through into our reports. So there are four main capitalized values that we calculate: the past and the future, and then uninjured and injured. So it's each of those. So let's first look at the past uninjured period. And that is really that part of the graph. Okay, we create a little table that I've shown below there, where we actually complete these four blocks. We work them out. Okay, so in this case, the uninjured earnings, we can add up the uninjured earnings in every month from the date of accident to date of calculation, and I've just put a dummy value in there. Let's say that worked out to 700,000. Okay, then we would do the same for the future uninjured, which would be that pink block. And we can add all that up. Remember, we can add it now because we have multiplied it by the probability of survival, and we have adjusted it for the time value of money. That works out to 5.2 million. We would now do the same for the injured earnings. injured earnings. So the injured past, in that example I showed you, the claimant did not return to work, which means that the past injured earnings would be 0. The future would be that grey block, and if we add that up, let's say it comes to a value of 3.8. So those are the important things that we have calculated based on the particular earnings progression that has been proposed by the industrial psychologist. The way the loss of earnings is now calculated is we simply take the uninjured and subtract the injured. So for the past, the 700,000 minus the 0 stays at 700,000. The future, 5.2 minus 3.8 gets you to 1.4 million, and then the total loss is just the sum of those two, which gets you to 2.1 million. So that is how our graph then translates into the table and the actual loss of earnings. Just a reminder, if you have any questions or need more detail on anything, please enter it in the Q&A. Okay, I'm then going to move on to contingencies. So contingencies, you may know, are really adjustments for uncertainties. So as I said, the industrial psychologist does provide us with a career progression, but obviously that's not set in stone. No one knows for sure how the career will or would have progressed. There's always uncertainties around the earnings capacity. And some examples of those are things like unemployment, industry-specific risks, injuries and ill health, personal situations that the claimant may have, promotions that could occur earlier or later than expected. So all of those mean that there is some uncertainty about the proposed earnings progression. And it is hard to quantify them in exact terms. So a general percentage adjustment is made to allow for this. It is important to understand contingencies increase with time and with risk. So the longer the period that's being considered, the more risk there is because there's a longer time in which something can go wrong. So contingencies tend to be higher on future losses because the future period tends to be longer than the past period. Not always, but tends to be. And then contingencies tend to be higher for injured earnings compared to uninjured earnings. And that is because the accident generally increases the risk involved with the claimant. So the accident has occurred, there's now more uncertainty about what could happen to their career. You know, are there any sort of latent things that may come out over time? Or, you know, it's not always clear how it's going to affect their earnings. So that is why we tend to see contingencies that are higher in the injured state. As a guideline, contingencies tend to be around 0.5% per year of working life, or as per the table shown below. And that is typically for RAF matters. These are what we would call standard contingencies. What's important to understand is why there's a 0 for the past injured. So if you think about the injured state, that has actually happened. So the claimant has been injured. The past is the period from the date of accident to date. So that is really the history of his earnings since the accident. So those should be factual and should be known. So there should be no need to put a contingency on there because it should be factually verifiable earnings. The uninjured past, though, is hypothetical because the claimant has actually been injured. So had he not been injured, there is a hypothetical earnings progression that has been proposed. However, there's obviously risks with it. We don't know for sure that it would have happened. So I hope that explains why this is generally 0. And again, each case needs to be assessed on its own merits. So please don't assume that these are the contingencies that should always be applied. We see a huge range of contingencies, and it's always useful to look at judgments as well and see what judges have awarded for different matters and compare it to your own claimants. You know, how injured they are, how severe the accident was, what kind of industry they're working in, etc. Okay, so I wanted to show you how contingencies are then affecting the loss table. So I've got the same numbers that I had previously. I've just added in lines now for the contingencies. And if we applied standard contingencies, then we would apply 5% to the past uninjured. And the way that that is applied is we actually say, what is 5% of 700,000? and we deduct it from the 700,000, which leaves you with that value. The injured, as I said, injured past, we don't generally apply contingencies. In this case, the capitalized value is 0 as well, so that stays at 0. And the past loss of earnings is then 665 minus 0, stays at the 665. Notice how it's lower than what it would have been without contingencies, which would have been 700,000. And we do the same in the future here. If we apply 15%, we basically say what is 15% of 5.2 and subtract it from the 5.2 million. And then the same with the injured future, if we apply 25%. And then we subtract this one from the 4.42, which would give us the 1.57. And the sum of the past and the future loss gives you your total loss then. Interesting, that total loss is slightly higher than the loss without contingencies, but that is not always the case for loss of earnings calculations. And I think that's important to realize, is that it's not always intuitive or obvious what is going to happen to your loss on the loss of earnings side. The reason is because we deduct the injured earnings from the uninjured earnings, and you're applying contingencies to both sets of numbers. So sometimes, if you're working with the uninjured, if you make your contingencies higher, it reduces your loss, but the opposite happens with the injured. And it's the interplay between the two that eventually affects your total loss figure. So it's not always obvious that if you increase contingencies, your loss will increase or decrease in the loss of earnings space. The last thing I want to talk about for a loss of earnings calculation is the RAF cap. And obviously this just applies to road accident fund matters. But for those claims, there's a statutory cap that effectively limits the loss in each year to a maximum value. This cap is applied to the loss after contingencies and after apportionment. So it's the final adjustment that is made, and the intention of it is to limit the RAF's liability. And the value of the cap is set equal to the prevailing cap at the date of the accident. So RAF publishes a cap value every 3 months. And whenever the accident occurred, let's say it's June 2021, what we do is we look at what was the prevailing cap at June 2021, and we use that cap throughout that calculation. So if I show you that in a graph, you can see this was our earnings graph, and the difference between the two here is the loss. We could actually plot that as its own graph. So these gray lines would show you the loss in every year. And this red line then shows you the RAF cap for, I just made up where it could be for this matter. And you can see when the loss is greater than this cap value, what we do is we basically cut off or truncate the loss for that year. So, in that year it would be truncated, and in this period, and then all these losses here are below the cap, so they remain as is. But basically it just limits the loss to the cap value for every year. So obviously that is quite a technical calculation, so you wouldn't be able to do that yourselves. The contingencies, some attorneys do feel confident playing around with that themselves, but obviously if the cap impacts, that happens right at the end, and we would need to get involved to change that for you. However, what we do offer is a very nice tool, and I hope most of you know about this. If not, this is the time to listen. We have a Connect portal, which is our client portal, and in here we have a contingency calculator. So this allows you to, on an existing report, to play around with the contingencies and to see how they would affect the loss. And it also allows for the cap. And then once you are happy with the contingencies, you can then print out an addendum report. So I've got a little demo here that shows you, as I'm talking, this is an existing report. You can see what the loss is. There's change contingencies button, and then you can choose standard or custom, redo it, and you'll see the loss value changes. And once you're happy, you can print the report, and it creates an amendment report for you with the new values in it. It's also signed by the actuary. You can then print that off for yourself. So it's a very useful tool, and we've had really positive feedback from our clients on that. So yeah, I really encourage you to sign up if you haven't, because this is free and available for all our clients, yeah, as soon as you sign up. Okay, so that is it for the loss of earnings calculation. I'm just going to give a couple seconds or a minute just in case you have any questions, you'd like to type something up. Let something gel in your head a little bit, and I'm going to have a drink of water. Okay, so let's move on to the loss of support calculation. A loss of support calculation involves a claim from surviving dependents upon the death of a breadwinner. So that is the difference. Loss of earnings, the claimant is still alive and is claiming for the impact that the accident had on his earnings. In a loss of support, it's the remaining dependents that are claiming as a result of a death that has occurred. Now, what is important is that the remaining dependents cannot claim for the full earnings. So if a breadwinner was earning 10,000 Rand per month, the family cannot claim for that full 10,000 Rand per month. They can claim for the support, not the earnings. Now, what does the support mean? There are quite particular rules about how support is deemed to be allocated in the family. So obviously it can be debated, but there are rules that the court generally follows. And what they determine is that the family's income, combined income, is then apportioned into different shares. So typically 2 shares are given to the deceased and the spouse, and 1 share to each other dependent, so whether a child or a parent, etc. So what does that really mean? So let's say we had a family with a father, a mother, and 2 children. 2 shares would be given to the deceased, so it's that dark gray area. 2 shares to the spouse, let's say it's the red area, and 1 share to each of the children. So 2 plus 2 plus 1 plus 1 gives you 6 shares. Effectively, we are splitting that family pot into 6 shares, 6 pie pieces. And each child gets 1 pie piece, and each of the adults gets 2 pie pieces. That is how the court sees support being apportioned between the family. And the remaining dependents can claim for their loss of support, not the earnings. That's very important to understand. So let's consider, again, a typical family. And I'm just going to say a mother, father, and 2 children, just for simplicity. As I said, the mother and father each would be seen as receiving 2 shares of the income, and each child would receive 1 share. So the family pot is going to be split into 6, like the previous slide. The dark gray is going to be for the father, the red for the mother, and then each of the children get a little gray slice. In this case, let's assume that the father is earning 14,000 Rand in a particular month. Let's say the mother was earning 4,000 Rand in that same month. That means that the family pot is 18,000 Rand. Now we're going to split that into the 6 slices. 6 goes into 18, 3,000 times. So each slice is worth 3,000 Rand. So that means that each of the children are deemed to be supported with 3,000 Rand, that the father's support is 6,000 Rand, and the mother's support is 6,000 Rand. So that is how, before the accident has happened, that is how we deem the support to be apportioned between the family. Now let's say that the father has been killed in a road accident or an accident. Before the accident, the total support that was available to the wife and the children was 12,000 Rand. Okay, it was this red slice plus the 2 gray slices, 6, 3, and 3. So the total support that they were getting before any accident occurred was 12,000. But now, how much is available now that the accident has occurred? The mother's earnings are 4,000. So that is the only amount that is available now to support these 3 family members. So the loss of support that they've suffered is the difference between the 2, is 8,000 Rand. Now, how do we split that 8,000 Rand between these 3 dependents? There's a very important judgment that we use to do that, and it's called the Santam versus Faree judgment. And that judgment states that the surviving spouse's earnings must first go towards her own support, and only if anything is remaining can it be used to support the kids. So I'll just repeat that. The surviving spouse's earnings must first be used towards her own support, and only if there's anything left can it be used to support the children. So in this case, the surviving spouse's earnings are 4,000 Rand, but her support was 6,000. That's what she was getting before the accident. So she must use all of this towards her own support, and she doesn't have enough. There's a 2,000 Rand loss of support because she can only meet 4,000. So her loss is 2,000. But now all her earnings have been used up to support herself, so the children have suffered a full loss of 3,000 each, so a total of 6,000. So you can see that the loss of support of 8,000 is split, 2,000 to the mother and 3,000 to each child. If we now consider the alternative that it is not the father who passed away, but the mother who passed away, the support that the father and the children were getting before the accident was also 12,000 Rand. Okay, he was this dark grey segment, and then they're the two lighter greys. It was also 12,000. But now, how much support are they getting after the accident? Well, he's got 14,000 Rand that is available. So they actually financially have more now that the accident has occurred than they had before the accident. This is a very important concept, and it's probably the concept I've spent the most time on the phone with attorneys trying to explain. And I think it comes down to the fact that it's the support, not the earnings, that are being claimed for. So that's why I'm really stressing this point. So the loss of support in this case is 0. And the reason, if you think about it, the 14,000 is enough to cover his support of 6,000 and each of the children's support, and there's 2,000 left over. So financially, those 3 dependents are actually in a better situation than they were before the accident, financially. And so we tend to see this situation if the 2 spouses are earning quite different earnings, and the one that passes away was earning significantly less than the surviving spouse. So yeah, it's always something good to consider in your particular situation. The breadwinner or the person that's passed away, what are their earnings relative to the surviving spouse? Sometimes the surviving spouse may not have a claim, but the 2 children may still have a claim. It all depends on the relative earnings. Okay, so that concept is important to understand because that comes into our loss of support calculation. So like we did for loss of earnings, we can show a graph where we show the deceased earnings and we show the spouse's earnings. So the deceased earnings obviously are but for the accident because the deceased has passed away. The spouse's earnings are also but for the accident. So we don't really have an uninjured and injured situation here. Everything is what would their earnings have been had the accident not occurred. So we project those. Again, that is not something we come up with. It is either instructed or taken from an industrial psychologist report. And then what we do is we look at each particular month. So let's pick any period. What we do is we then combine the deceased earnings and the spouse's earnings into the pie, like our last slide, and we look at who is dependent at that time. And that's important because the dependency changes over time. Typically, children are only dependent until age 18 or 21, so they may have dropped out of that nuclear family by that stage. So every month we got to say who is dependent, how many shares must we split that pot into, and then we consider what would their support have been had the accident not occurred, and what is their support now, using those concepts I spoke about in the previous slide. And we do that for every single month, and then add them up. And again, the future period, these earnings are also adjusted for the time value of interest, time value of money, as well as the probability that each dependent would be alive at that period. So the calculation does get quite complicated. Again, the past and future periods are the same as they were for a loss of earnings calculation. And I've just given an example of a table. It's generally easier because we're just adding up the past loss and then the future loss, obviously allowing for time value of money and the probability of survival, but there's no uninjured and injured to deduct from each other. We just actually show the past loss and the future loss, and the sum of those two gives you the total loss for each dependent. Okay, again, there are contingencies that are applied to loss of support matters, but important to understand there are extra risks here, and the risks are really affecting the need for or the duration of support. So not only is it the earnings that are that there's uncertainty about, there's also uncertainty about who needs support or how long they need support for. And some examples of that are divorce. Obviously there's only a need to support each other or a requirement to support each other when you are legally married. So there's the divorce risk. There's the potential for getting remarried. There's the potential of having more children, where children could become independent at earlier or later dates. Obviously, mortality itself and the probability of survival is also uncertain. And then obviously the income streams themselves have the same amount of uncertainty around them. So there are these extra risks for loss of support as well. And I'm also going to show you standard contingencies. Again, they tend to increase with time. So just like the loss of earnings, the future periods tend to have higher contingencies than past periods. And then it tends to be higher for spouses in future because spouses are dependent for life, whereas children, as I said, tend to only be dependent until age 18 or 21. So those future periods tend to be slightly shorter for children, which means the standard ones that we see, and again, we call them the standard RAF contingencies, tend to be slightly lower for children in future. But again, a big proviso on that, this is not at all saying these are the contingencies that should be applied. This is just sort of standard ones, and each dependent's risks need to be assessed separately. Okay, and the way the contingencies affect the table and the losses here, so I used just some examples of a spouse and a child, and I put some dummy losses in there. If we applied the standard contingencies for a spouse in the past, it's 5%. We basically, again, just take 5% of 500,000 and deduct it from the 500,000, gives you that as the post-contingency loss. And then the same for the future. If we take off 15% from the 1.2, we get that value, and adding the two together just gives you our loss value for the spouse. And then for a child, it would be the same sort of thing, 5% deducted from the 350,000, and then 10% deducted from the future, and then adding those two together. And then the total loss, we would just add the spouse and the child together. What is important on the loss of support, you can see that applying contingencies will always reduce the claim, because nothing is deducted from anything. We're not saying there's an uninjured column and then an injured column that gets deducted from it to determine the loss. We are just presenting the loss values already. So the loss was 500,000. If you take contingencies off, it will definitely reduce the loss. So it's a little easier on the loss of support side. Whenever you apply contingencies, higher contingencies mean lower loss. Okay, and then lastly, the RAF cap. So if the matter is a road accident fund matter, again, the RAF cap does come into play, and it's applied pretty much the same way. The only difference is we add up the losses for all the different dependents in that matter, and we compare their total loss to the cap value. And again, the cap value is the prevailing cap at the date of the accident. And we would then limit the loss in years where the total loss is above the cap value. And let's consider if it was this year, for example, let's say the cap reduced the loss by 10%. What we would do is then proportionately reduce each dependent's loss by that 10%. Okay, we've reached the end of the presentation. So this is a time where I will go through some questions. If you have any, please use the time to also add any more in. I believe we do have some questions, so I'm just going to go through them. But yeah, please use this time. There's no rush. You can add in more questions now if you'd like. Okay, so the one question that I've been asked is to just repeat the part about the mother's support. So I don't know if that is the one where there's no loss or where there is a loss. The no loss, okay. Okay, so it's probably this slide. And yeah, thank you for asking that, because that definitely is one of the areas that has the most questions we find from attorneys. So let me talk through that again. So if you remember, before the accident, in this particular case, the husband was earning 14,000 and the mother was earning 4,000. So this total family pot was 18,000. And we split it as this little picture on the right shows, 6,000 to each, 3,000 to each child. So this was how support was deemed to be apportioned. Now, if the mother has passed away, the amount that's left or that's now available to support the family is 14,000. So it was 12,000 for the father and the two kids. It's now 14,000 because all of his earnings can be used to support the two children and himself. There is no mother anymore that needs the financial support. So there's actually more that the family, the remaining dependents, have financially at their disposal to support them. So they can cover the 6,000 that he was being supported with previously. So the 6,000 plus the one child's 3,000 and the other child's 3,000. That's only 12,000. There's an extra 2,000 now that the three of them have that they can share amongst themselves. So the loss of support is actually zero. Obviously, the mother's earnings are not received, but the mother was using her 4,000 to support herself, but she also was using that extra 2,000 to make up her 6,000. So the father here was actually supporting the mother, not the other way around. So when the mother passes away, there's actually no loss of support. That's the key concept to understand. So I hope that makes sense. Let me have a look and see if there's some more questions. Okay, so that is an interesting question. So one of them is, what if the children go to university? Does the dependency depend on the course or time spent at university, excluding years they fail? So it's probably not an actuarial answer, but we definitely do see industrial psychologist reports where the period of dependency is affected by what the children choose to do after school. So if they start working straight after school, then generally the argument is, okay, they're not dependent anymore. But if they choose to do a long course at university, then the industrial psychologist said, well, they would have been dependent until the end of their course. I think it really becomes a legal issue and can be debated in court. I suppose if someone decides to be a perpetual student, I suppose there would be an argument that there's a point at which it's no longer deemed fair that they should be supported. But typically we do see support until the end of a university course. If they keep failing courses, I suppose, again, that is debatable, like at what point does the support be deemed to be cut off? And it might be also related to the earnings of the family and the situation of the family. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about it, really. And it really is a legal call of, how long does support actually last? Yeah, so it's interesting. I think it would be for the attorney to then argue. Maybe if the family has a lot of means and it makes sense that they would have supported this child through a long university course, I think then it could be argued that they should be supported then. Yeah, we would work with you in that. So if you instructed us to allow for that full period of support, we would do that. Yeah, I hope that adds some insight. Okay, yes, this is very interesting. I had this as a a comment to maybe make, and then I chose not to, so I'm really glad it came up as a question. So it says, could you mention the loss of support cap is no longer limited to the family, but is applied separately to each dependent? Yes, so there was a judgment that went through. It was the Bester versus RAF judgment, where it was ruled that instead of adding up all the family's losses and then comparing that total loss to the cap, it should be done individually per family member. So each dependent's loss is individually compared to that same higher cap, and then only if each individual loss breaches the cap is it truncated. So that obviously gives a higher loss overall because the cap is a lot higher than each loss then. So that did go through, and we have actually been asked to calculate some cases using that judgment. I know it's currently being appealed, so we're not aware of the final verdict on that yet. But yeah, it's very interesting, and it was quite topical. We wrote an article about it a couple months ago. So if you would like to see it, please let us know. But it was in one of our previous newsletters. So yeah, it is quite a contentious issue at the moment. Let's see any more. I think some have been answered during the presentation as well. While we're just combining them, the one question that I often get asked is, can we propose contingencies, or can we give advice on contingencies? It's very important to understand that contingencies are not an actuarial assumption. So we don't assess the claimants, and we don't, go into detail about what industry they're in or the state of their health or any of that. So we cannot assess what the risk is about this claimant and their earnings. So in courts, I mean, it's very clear in all my discussions with advocates, it's very clear that I can never say we propose these contingencies. So it's definitely not the actuarial domain. It's generally a negotiation tool. So it's actually between the attorneys. The judge often has an opinion about it. And then I would say look at case law to see what contingencies are typically applied. Obviously, we see contingencies because we're instructed on matters on what contingencies to apply. So we have a sense of what typical contingencies would be. For example, it's very unusual to see extremely high contingencies, like 90% or something. We're happy to talk to you about contingencies, but we can never give advice on it, and we can never testify on why a contingency should be something. That definitely is not in our domain. Okay, so this question says, what happens to a child that is crippled or has a mental defect and will always depend on the parents until which stage would the loss be calculated? Yes, thank you for that. There is a ruling that stated that disabled children are actually entitled to 2 shares, not 1 share, of the family's income. So if a child is, severely handicapped, that is how we would calculate it, and the dependency is also for life. We have done quite a few calculations with that. So it's important to consider. Obviously, there's a definition of how disabled are they for that to kick in, or that ruling to apply. And I think that also becomes a legal issue. It would be good to look at the previous cases and see the extent of the injury or the impairment to see if you could argue for the same thing. But definitely there is precedent that if a child is disabled, that their loss of support can be for life, and they can get a higher share, because obviously there are high costs associated with having that disability, maybe more transport costs, more medical care, more it is logical they would require more support than a non-impaired child. I think that is most of the questions. Thank you for these questions. They have been very insightful, or they've touched on important topics. Just having a look to see if there's some more. Possibly. Yeah, okay, there's one that's very specific. It's given me a case of actual earnings for a father and a mother and children. So I think that one we can deal with outside of this. It's very specific. So we will definitely reply to you, but I think maybe it's a little too specific to deal with verbally for everyone. Yeah, and if you have any, like along those lines, if you have anything like that, please do send it through to us because we're always happy to help you with your specific circumstance. Okay, I'm just looking if there's another one. Okay, so there's one regarding earnings. What determines whether lower or higher contingencies must be applied for both uninjured and injured? Okay, so that's really, the issues that I was mentioning, the risks and some of the examples. Let me just find that slide now. So this slide about contingencies. So it's all these kind of factors that you need to think about in the uninjured state versus the injured state. And I mean, things like industry, that's a good example. So some industries are more, maybe there's more risks involved, and some maybe jobs are more stable, or it's less likely that you'd be retrenched or dismissed. So I think sometimes the industry is important to look at. The extent of the injuries is a big one. So, if it's a really bad injury and maybe, it's very unlikely this person would go back to work, there is an argument for a higher contingency. Personal situations, that's often if there's pre-existing conditions or a history of repeatedly leaving jobs or whatever, that you could then argue there could be a higher contingency applied. We have actually, interestingly, seen quite a few judgments where the judges almost stepped in and said the earnings postulations are too generous, and they've applied higher than standard contingencies, almost saying, that the industrial psychologist's projections are too generous or not realistic enough. So, it might be worth also looking at the projections and seeing, okay, is it a bit on the generous side, and then maybe you're at risk of higher contingencies being applied. There's no quick answer to that, but I think the more familiar you get with these cases, and the better feel you have of what contingencies have been applied. And we do look at judgments every week. So I think it's really also useful to look at past judgments and see, what has been applied, what was finally ruled on, just to give you a sense of the landscape of contingencies. I would definitely encourage that. Okay, I think there's one more. Okay, there's one that's talking about earnings potential versus likely earnings. Yeah, that is an interesting point because someone might have a good earnings potential, but in the current markets or with the kind of current economy, whatever, there might be few jobs available. That does have to be taken into account. So unemployment risks and that are contingencies that are applied to allow for that. So so it is actually the earnings that need to be considered. It is tricky because it is hard to predict for the far future how what the market's going to be like. But that definitely is brought in, and generally it's contingencies that are applied to allow for the difference between the actual market conditions and someone's theoretical earnings potential. I think that's the bulk of the questions. Okay, so this question says, if the risk is high, do you then apply a lower contingencies for uninjured and higher for injured, or is it the other way around? Okay, yes, sorry. So that is a good question. I think that's, yeah, to follow up to the previous question. So basically, if the risk on earnings is high, you apply a higher contingency. But now you do it separately for uninjured earnings and injured earnings. So you first think about uninjured. So this is hypothetical. Had the accident not occurred, what are the risks involved with those earnings? So let's say they were at some corporates, they haven't been injured, they've got a certain qualification. There's obviously risks that the progression isn't what you think. Let's say they're in an industry where there's a lot of volatility and risk. You would then apply a higher contingency on that uninjured earning. Okay. You then look at the injured earnings. Maybe it's a different industry, or maybe it's you've got to look at that separately and go, what are the risks on the injured earnings? And if there's a higher risk, you put a higher contingency. So higher contingency always means higher risk because it's a percentage deduction from that amount. So that is always the same. Higher risk means higher percentage contingency. The same on the loss of support. It's just when you then calculate what that means for the loss, you're taking uninjured minus injured. It then doesn't always mean your loss is going to go up or down the way you think because you're subtracting one from the other. But that's why I, again, would encourage you to use the contingency calculator, because as you use that, you start seeing, okay, this is how it's affecting the loss because it's the one minus the other. And you can really get a good sense of it there. I think those are most of the questions, or all of the questions, actually. So I would like to just end with these QR codes. So the one on the left is a RAF toolkit that we have on our website. So in there you'd find a variety of templates, webinars, podcasts, other videos similar to this one, which go through a whole lot of content. So if you found this useful but you'd like more detail, please scan that left-hand QR code, and that'll take you to a vast array of information that can help you understand these matters in even more detail. And then the QR code on the right is if you would like to log into Connect or get help with logging into Connect. This will take you straight there. So if you haven't done it, I really encourage you to do that. If you need help, please phone in and we will help you on the phone, get you logged in real time, and take you to the contingency calculator as well. Please, I would really encourage you to log into those. And that's it. That's a wrap. Thank you so much for your attendance. I hope it was useful. I hope you learned a lot. I know it's a lot of detail. If you have any further questions, please send us a message. We will definitely get back to you, and we will send out the slides to you as well. Thank you for your attendance.